I stood in my kitchen holding a cold cup of coffee while my children fought over my money in the next room. Ethan wanted the house. Jason kept saying he deserved a larger share because he was struggling. Melissa cried about how much she had done for me lately. Not one of them asked if I was okay. Not one of them asked if I was hurt listening to every word. Then Ethan laughed and said Mom doesn't need all that money anymore anyway. And that was the moment I realized something terrifying. My children weren't waiting for me to live. They were waiting for me to die. What they didn't know was that I had already given every dollar away. If this story touches your heart in any way, I'd love for you to stay with me until the end. Don't forget to like and subscribe, and please tell me in the comments, what would you have done if you were in my place? And wherever you're watching from tonight, let me know your city and the time there. I truly love reading every single comment. There was a time when my family used to laugh around that same dining table. Sometimes I sit in my living room late at night and try to remember exactly when everything changed. I never find the answer. Maybe families don't break apart all at once. Maybe they crack slowly, quietly, one disappointment at a time, until one day the whole thing collapses under the weight of things nobody wanted to say out loud. 43 years ago, Richard and I started with almost nothing. We were 23 years old, newly married, and living in a tiny apartment above a laundromat in Columbus, Ohio. The radiator barely worked in winter, and every time the downstairs machines ran, our floor shook like a small earthquake. But I swear to you, those were some of the happiest years of my life. Richard used to kiss my forehead every morning before work and say one day we'll have a house full of kids and enough money to stop counting pennies. Back then, we counted every penny. I worked mornings at a diner while Richard stocked shelves at a hardware store. At night, we sat at our little kitchen table planning our future on scraps of paper. We dreamed about owning our own business someday, and somehow, little by little, we made it happen. Richard opened a small home goods store when Ethan was 3 years old. I still remember standing beside him the day we unlocked the front door for the first time. The sign read, Clark Home Supply. The letters were slightly crooked because Richard hung them himself. He was proud anyway. I think it gives the place character, he told me with that crooked smile of his. For years, we worked nonstop. I handled the books while Richard managed customers. We missed vacations. We skipped anniversaries. There were Christmas mornings when we opened presents at the store because we couldn't afford to close for the day. But we built something honest, something real, and our children grew up inside that store. Ethan, our oldest, was always serious. Even as a little boy, he hated losing. If another kid got a bigger piece of cake at a birthday party, Ethan noticed. If Jason got praised for something, Ethan worked twice as hard to outdo him. Still, he had a good heart back then. At least I thought he did. Melissa was sunshine as a child. She used to dance through the aisles of the store wearing my scarves around her shoulders like movie star dresses. Customers adored her. She hugged everyone. Jason was our surprise baby. Wild, loud, impossible to control. Richard used to call him the tornado. Every Friday night, we had dinner together, no matter how busy life became. Richard insisted on it. No matter what happens, he'd say this family sits at the same table. For a long time we did, even after the children grew older. Even after Ethan became an accountant in Cleveland. Even after Melissa married Daniel Turner and moved to the suburbs. Even after Jason bounced from job to job trying to find himself. We still gathered for birthdays, holidays, Sunday dinners. Or at least we pretended to. Looking back now, I think the first real change happened after Richard got sick. It started with exhaustion. Then came the coughing. Then the hospital visits. Then words like biopsy and stage 3. The doctors gave us 18 months. We got 11. I still remember the sound of the heart monitor the night he died. Steady 1 second. Silent the next. People always describe grief like an explosion. For me, it felt more like drowning quietly. After Richard passed away, I sold the store. I couldn't walk through those aisles without hearing his voice. Benjamin Carter, our longtime lawyer, and one of Richard's closest friends, helped me handle the paperwork. The business sold for far more than we expected. Combined with our savings, life insurance, and retirement accounts, I suddenly became the owner of more money than I had ever imagined having. I didn't think much about it at first. I was too busy surviving. But my children noticed. At the funeral reception, only 3 hours after we buried Richard, Ethan pulled me aside near the coffee table. "Mom," he said gently, "you should really let me help you manage Dad's finances now. It's a lot for someone your age." Someone your age. I remember those words because they stung. Not enough to upset me then, but enough to stay with me. A few weeks later, Melissa started bringing up the house. "You know," she said, "while helping me fold laundry, this place is way too big for one person." I smiled weakly. "It's been my home for 40 years. "I know," she replied softly. "I'm just saying, you could sell it and live somewhere easier, somewhere smaller." At the time, I believed she cared about me. Now I wonder if she was already calculating the value of the property in her head. Jason was different. Jason didn't hide his problems very well. He came to me one afternoon wearing expensive sneakers and asking for money to invest in a custom auto shop with a friend. "This is my chance, Mom," he told me. "I just need a little help getting started." "How much is a little help?" I asked carefully. 30,000. I nearly dropped my coffee cup. When I hesitated, his entire expression changed. "You have the money," he snapped. "Dad would have helped me." That sentence haunted me for weeks. Dad would have helped me. Maybe Richard would have. Richard believed people deserved second chances. I did too, until I started realizing my children no longer saw me as their mother. They saw me as access, as opportunity, as inheritance waiting to happen. The calls became more frequent after that. Ethan asking whether I'd updated my will. Melissa asking about my retirement accounts. Jason hinting about bills and debts. Sometimes they even called each other while sitting in my living room whispering about things they thought I couldn't hear. One afternoon, I walked into the kitchen and heard Ethan say quietly, "Mom has more money than she realizes." I froze in the hallway. Melissa lowered her voice. "Do you know how much?" "Not exactly," Ethan answered. "But after the store sale, probably close to 2 million. 2 million. The way he said it made my stomach turn. Not because of the number, because there was no love in his voice. Only hunger. That night, I sat alone in bed, holding one of Richard's old flannel shirts against my chest. I could still smell traces of his cologne if I closed my eyes hard enough. And suddenly, I remembered something he told me years earlier after a cousin cheated him in a business deal. "Money never changes people. Addie," he said quietly, "it reveals them." At the time, I didn't fully understand what he meant. Now, I did, and for the first time in my life, I became afraid of my own children. After Richard died, my house stopped feeling like a home. It became something else, a place people visited with hidden intentions. At first, I tried to convince myself I was imagining things. Grief changes your mind in strange ways. It makes you suspicious, emotional, sensitive. That's what I kept telling myself every time one of my children asked another uncomfortable question about money. But deep down, I knew something had shifted. 3 months after the funeral, Ethan started coming over every Sunday morning. At first, it felt comforting. He'd bring coffee from the cafe near my neighborhood, and sit at the kitchen table while I cooked eggs and toast. For a little while, it almost felt like old times. "Just checking on you, Mom," he'd say warmly. I wanted to believe him. God help me, I really did. But eventually, I noticed the pattern. Every visit somehow drifted toward finances. "Have you reviewed Dad's retirement accounts yet? You should really simplify your banking. Do you know how much property taxes are going up next year?" One morning, Ethan pulled out a folder from his leather briefcase while I was pouring coffee. "I actually made a list of investment options for you," he said casually. I stared at the papers. Charts, numbers, projected returns. "You did all this for me?" I asked quietly. "Of course," he replied. "I just don't want anyone taking advantage of you." The irony almost made me laugh, but I said nothing. Ethan leaned forward in his chair. "You know, Mom, at your age, managing large assets alone can become dangerous." There it was again. At your age, as if growing older automatically erased my ability to think. "I'm doing fine," I told him gently. His jaw tightened for half a second before he forced another smile. "I know you think that." That sentence bothered me long after he left. "I know you think that. Not you are. Just you think." As if I were already slipping away mentally. Melissa approached things differently. She wrapped manipulation in kindness. She started calling every evening around 7. "Did you eat dinner? Mom, are you taking your vitamins? You sound tired." Sometimes she even cried while talking about how much she missed Dad. And every time she did, I felt guilty for doubting her intentions. Then one afternoon, she arrived carrying a stack of brochures. Retirement communities, condominiums, luxury senior apartments. She spread them across my dining room table like a real estate agent. "Look how beautiful these places are," she said brightly. "No stairs, no yard work. Security staff 24/7. I stared down at the glossy photos. Swimming pools, community lounges, tiny kitchens, tiny bedrooms, tiny lives. "I like my home," I said quietly. Melissa sighed dramatically. "Mom, this house is enormous. It's just impractical now." "This house is where your father proposed to me." She looked uncomfortable for exactly 2 seconds. Then she said something that hollowed me out from the inside. "Well, memories don't pay maintenance bills." I looked at her in disbelief. Was this really my daughter? The little girl who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms? The same child who once cried for 2 hours when her goldfish died? I wanted to ask her what happened to her, but I was afraid of the answer. Jason at least was honest about needing money. That almost made him easier to understand. Almost. He began showing up randomly without calling first. Sometimes late at night, sometimes smelling like beer, sometimes pretending everything was perfectly fine. One evening, he walked into my kitchen while I was making soup and immediately opened the refrigerator like he still lived there. "You got any sandwich meat?" he asked. "In the drawer." He slapped turkey slices onto bread while talking non-stop about a business opportunity. Apparently, his friend Trevor wanted to open a custom auto shop. According to Jason, it was guaranteed success. "All I need is startup cash," he said. "Then I'll pay you back with interest." How much, I asked carefully. 50,000. I nearly choked. "Jason." "Come on, Mom," he interrupted. "You can afford it. That's not the point." His expression darkened immediately. "Then what is the point?" "The point is that you already borrowed money last year. That was different. You never paid it back." He slammed the refrigerator door hard enough to rattle the magnets. "You always treat Ethan like he's some financial genius," he snapped. "But the second I ask for help, suddenly I'm irresponsible." "That's not true." "Yes, it is." His face turned red with anger. "You have all this money sitting around while I'm drowning. I felt something crack inside me then, not because he needed help, but because of the resentment in his voice, like my existence somehow owed him compensation. "I'm your mother," I whispered, "not your bank." For a moment, silence filled the kitchen. Then Jason laughed bitterly. "Well, apparently, you're a pretty bad mother, too." The words hit harder than he probably intended, or maybe exactly as hard as he intended. He left without saying goodbye. I sat alone at the kitchen table for almost an hour afterward, staring at the untouched bowl of soup between my hands. That night, I cried harder than I had cried in months. Not because of the insult, because somewhere deep down, I realized my children no longer came to see me. They came to see what they could get from me. The worst part was how normal it slowly became. Ethan checking my mail to help organize things. Melissa asking subtle questions about my savings. Jason calling only when another bill collector came after him. Even holidays felt different. That Thanksgiving, I cooked for 12 people while my arthritis screamed through my hands. Olivia helped me in the kitchen for hours without complaining once, but everyone else, they barely noticed me. Ethan and Jason argued about housing prices over dinner. Melissa kept mentioning how expensive college had become for Olivia's younger brother. Every conversation circled back to money. Every single one. At one point, I walked into the hallway carrying empty plates and overheard Ethan whispering to Melissa near the staircase. "Mom's sitting on a fortune." Melissa lowered her voice. "Do you know exactly how much Benjamin handled the store sale?" Ethan said. "Based on market estimates, probably close to $2 million after taxes and investments." $2 million. They said it so coldly, like accountants discussing inventory, not children discussing their mother's life savings. Then came the sentence that changed something in me forever. Ethan shrugged and said quietly, "We just need to make sure she doesn't give it away to strangers." I froze behind the hallway wall. My heart started pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. Because suddenly, I understood something terrifying. They weren't worried about me losing my money. They were worried about losing access to it themselves. That night, after everyone left, I wandered through the dark house, turning off lights one by one. The silence felt unbearable. I stopped in Richard's old study and sat in his leather chair surrounded by framed family photos from happier years. Birthdays, graduations, Christmas mornings, smiling faces, back when love looked real. I picked up one photograph of Richard holding Melissa as a little girl, while Ethan stood beside them grinning proudly. Jason was still a baby then. We looked so happy, so safe. I held the picture against my chest and whispered through tears, "What happened to us?" But the room stayed silent, and for the first time in my life, I began wondering if my children loved me at all. I used to love birthdays. When the children were little, I stayed up half the night decorating cakes by hand because we couldn't afford bakery prices. Richard would hang crooked streamers across the dining room while pretending he was some kind of professional party planner. The house always felt warm back then, alive. But my 68th birthday was different from the moment I woke up. The silence in the house felt heavy somehow, like something bad was waiting for me before the day had even begun. Still, I tried. God knows I tried. I spent the entire morning cooking. Pot roast in the oven, homemade mashed potatoes, green bean casserole, Melissa's favorite peach cobbler. I even polished Richard's old silverware because he used to insist birthdays deserved real forks. By 6 o'clock, the dining room looked beautiful. Candles glowed softly against the walls. Family photographs lined the shelves. For a moment, standing there alone in my navy blue dress, I almost convinced myself everything would feel normal again. Then the front door opened, and reality walked in. Ethan arrived first with his wife Carol. He barely hugged me before pulling out his phone to answer a work email. "Happy birthday, Mom," he muttered distractedly. Melissa came 20 minutes later, carrying a grocery store bouquet that still had the price tag attached. Jason showed up last. Late. Again. He smelled faintly like whiskey when he kissed my cheek. "Sorry," he said. "Traffic." Nobody believed that. At first, dinner went smoothly enough. We talked about the weather, Olivia's new job at the pediatric clinic, football, gas prices, safe conversations, the kind families use when they're trying desperately not to touch the truth sitting in the middle of the table. I noticed Olivia watching me carefully throughout dinner. Unlike everyone else, she actually paid attention. Whenever my water glass emptied, she refilled it. When my arthritis started bothering me, she quietly took over serving plates without being asked. Such small things. But after months of feeling invisible, kindness felt enormous. Halfway through dessert, Ethan leaned back in his chair and sighed heavily. "This house really needs updates," he said casually while looking around the dining room. My stomach tightened immediately. Melissa glanced at him. "Ethan." "What?" he shrugged. "I'm just being honest." Jason snorted into his beer. "He's right. The kitchen alone probably needs 30 grand worth of work." I set my fork down slowly. "This house is fine." Ethan gave me the same patient smile people use on stubborn children. "Mom, the market's changing. If you ever decide to sell, you'll need renovations." There it was again. Sell, always money. Melissa dabbed her lips with a napkin before speaking softly. "To be fair, Mom, maybe downsizing wouldn't be such a bad idea." I stared at her. "You too." "Oh, don't make it sound terrible," she replied quickly. "We're just concerned about you being alone here." Jason laughed bitterly. "No offense, but Ethan's probably more concerned about property value." Ethan's expression hardened instantly. "At least I'm financially responsible." "Oh, please," Jason snapped. "You're already measuring the damn curtains. Better than begging Mom for handouts every 6 months." Jason slammed his beer bottle onto the table. "You think you deserve everything because you wear a suit and use words like portfolio. I think I've actually earned success." Melissa jumped in immediately. "This is exactly why Mom needs a clear will." The room went silent. Even Olivia stopped moving. I felt my chest tighten painfully. "A will," I repeated quietly. Melissa looked uncomfortable for half a second before pushing forward anyway. "Well?" "Yes. I mean, eventually these things have to be discussed. On my birthday. At my dinner table. While I was still alive." Ethan nodded slowly. "She's right, Mom. Honestly, it would prevent confusion later." Confusion. Such a polite word for greed. Jason pointed his bottle toward Ethan. "Oh, you'd love that, wouldn't you? You probably already divided the money in your head. At least I'm not drowning in debt." Jason shoved his chair backward so violently it scraped across the hardwood floor. "You think you're better than me? I think Dad would be ashamed of you." That sentence exploded through the room like a gunshot. Jason lunged halfway out of his seat. Melissa stood up, too yelling at both of them to stop. Carol stared down at her plate, pretending not to notice. And I just sat there frozen, watching my children fight over pieces of my life, like scavengers circling something already dead. Then Ethan said the sentence that finally shattered whatever hope I still had. "We all know Mom won't need this place forever anyway." The words hit me so hard, I physically stopped breathing for a moment. Won't need this place forever, as if my death were simply an upcoming business transaction. Olivia stood abruptly. "That's enough." Every head turned toward her. Her voice shook with anger. "She's sitting right here." Melissa looked embarrassed. "Olivia, stay out of this." "No," Olivia snapped. You're talking about Grandma like she's already gone." Silence swallowed the room. Jason looked away first. Ethan rubbed his jaw irritably. But nobody apologized. Not one of them. I slowly pushed my chair back from the table. "I think I'm tired," I whispered. Melissa immediately switched into fake concern. "Mom, are you okay?" I almost laughed. The performance was insulting at this point. "I just need some air." I walked into the kitchen before anyone could see the tears building in my eyes. My hands shook so badly, I had to grip the countertop to steady myself. From the dining room, I could still hear muffled arguing. Ethan's voice, Jason yelling back, Melissa trying to mediate. None of them came after me, except Olivia. A minute later, she quietly stepped into the kitchen carrying my untouched slice of birthday cake. She sat beside me without speaking at first. Then she gently touched my hand. "I'm sorry," she whispered. That nearly broke me. Not because of the apology. Because she was the only person in that house who understood I needed one. I stared down at the cake while tears blurred my vision. "I don't understand what happened," I admitted softly. Olivia squeezed my hand tighter. "You didn't do anything wrong, Grandma, but I wondered if maybe I had. Maybe Richard and I spent so many years giving our children everything they wanted that they never learned gratitude. Maybe love without boundaries turns into entitlement. Maybe we built successful adults, but failed to build good ones." After a while, Olivia helped me clean the kitchen, while everyone else slowly filtered out of the house. Nobody mentioned the argument again. Ethan left first without hugging me goodbye. Melissa kissed my cheek and said, "Try not to stress yourself out." Jason disappeared without saying anything at all. By 10:30, the house was silent again. Olivia stayed behind to help me wrap leftovers. Before leaving, she hugged me tightly near the front door. "I love you," she whispered. And for the first time all evening, I believed someone meant it. After she left, I locked the front door and stood alone in the dark hallway. The birthday candles had burned themselves into melted wax puddles. Half-finished wine glasses still sat on the dining table. The house smelled like cold food and disappointment. I slowly sat down in Richard's old chair and stared at the family photos hanging on the wall. Then I whispered the words that changed everything. "I can't leave them my life's work." And deep down, I think that was the exact moment my final decision truly began. For 3 days after my birthday dinner, I barely slept. Every time I closed my eyes, I heard Ethan's voice again. "Mom won't need this place forever anyway." The sentence replayed in my mind like a broken record. I tried distracting myself with small things. Laundry, gardening, old television shows Richard used to love. Nothing worked. The house felt different now. Not lonely, unsafe. Not because I thought my children would physically hurt me, but because I finally understood something painful. They were already emotionally preparing for my death, and somewhere deep inside themselves, they had started viewing my life as an asset waiting to be divided. On the 4th morning, I woke up before sunrise and sat alone at the kitchen table with a cup of tea growing cold between my hands. Richard's photograph stood near the coffee maker. I stared at his face for a long time. "You always saw people clearly," I whispered softly. "I think I refused to." Then I reached for the phone. Benjamin Carter answered on the second ring. "Ben speaking." "It's Addison." There was immediate warmth in his voice. "Well, hello, Addie." Nobody had called me Addie since Richard died. Just hearing the nickname almost made me cry. "You sound tired," Benjamin said gently. "I need to talk to you." His voice changed instantly. "What happened?" I looked toward the empty dining room before answering. My children. That was all I had to say. Benjamin exhaled quietly. Come by the office at noon. Benjamin's law office sat on the second floor of an old brick building downtown. Richard used to joke that the place smelled like expensive paper and regret. Oddly enough, it still did. When I walked in, Benjamin immediately stood from behind his desk. At 72, he moved slower than he used to, but his eyes remained sharp. He hugged me tightly. For one dangerous second, I almost broke down completely in his arms. Instead, I forced myself to sit. Benjamin poured coffee without asking how I took it. After 40 years of friendship, he already knew. 2 sugars, tiny splash of cream. The familiar gesture hurt my heart. Because my own children barely remembered how I drank coffee anymore. Benjamin settled into the chair across from me. Tell me everything? So I did. I told him about the birthday dinner, the arguments, the conversations about my house, the pressure from Ethan, Jason asking for money, Melissa bringing retirement brochures. As I spoke, Benjamin's expression darkened more and more. By the time I finished, the office had gone completely silent. Finally, he leaned back heavily in his chair. I was afraid of this, he admitted quietly. I looked up sharply. You noticed it too? Benjamin hesitated before answering. After Richard passed, Ethan started calling me. My stomach tightened instantly. What? He asked general questions at first. Benjamin explained carefully. About estate taxes, probate laws, trust structures. I stared at him in disbelief. How long ago? About 6 months after the funeral? 6 months. Richard hadn't even been gone a full year. I suddenly felt sick. Benjamin removed his glasses and rubbed his eyes tiredly. I didn't tell you because I hoped I was reading too much into it. But you weren't. No, he said softly. I wasn't. The room fell silent again. I stared down at my hands resting in my lap. Hands that had packed school lunches. Hands that stitched Halloween costumes. Hands that worked 16-hour days beside Richard to build a future for our children. And somehow, after everything, this was where we ended up. Benjamin finally leaned forward. What do you want to do? I swallowed hard. I want to protect what Richard and I built. He studied my face carefully. You're talking about changing the estate plan? Yes. Benjamin nodded slowly, but didn't immediately respond. I appreciated that about him. He never rushed difficult conversations. You understand, he said gently, that if you make major changes now, your children may react badly. I let out a bitter laugh. They already are reacting badly. No, Addie. I mean legally. That made me pause. Benjamin folded his hands together. If you leave most of your assets elsewhere, Ethan especially may challenge your mental competency. The words sent a chill through me. You think my own son would try to prove I'm mentally unstable? Benjamin didn't answer immediately. That silence told me enough. I looked away toward the office window. Outside, people moved through downtown Columbus carrying coffee cups and briefcases, living ordinary lives. Meanwhile, I sat in a lawyer's office discussing whether my own children might someday try to erase my sanity for money. How had my life become this? I'm not confused, I whispered quietly. I know that Benjamin replied immediately. But courtrooms are ugly places. Greed makes people cruel. I thought about Ethan's calculating eyes, Jason's anger, Melissa's carefully rehearsed concern. And suddenly, I knew something with absolute certainty. If I died tomorrow without protecting myself, my children would destroy each other over every dollar Richard and I left behind. Maybe they already were. Benjamin slid a folder across the desk. What are my options? I asked. For the next hour, we discussed everything: trusts, asset transfers, charitable foundations, medical competency documentation, legal protections. The entire conversation felt surreal, like I was planning some elaborate escape instead of handling my own estate. At one point, Benjamin stopped speaking and looked directly at me. "You don't have to make decisions today." "Yes," I said quietly. "I do." He frowned slightly. "Why?" "Because if I waited any longer, guilt might stop me. Because mothers are trained to forgive endlessly. Because some broken part of me still wanted to believe my children would wake up and become kind again. But mostly, because I had finally realized something terrifying. If I kept protecting my children from consequences, they would never become better people. I took a shaky breath. "Richard and I spent our whole lives helping them," I said softly. "And somehow, it only taught them to expect more." Benjamin nodded sadly. "That happens more often than you'd think." I looked down at the paperwork spread across the desk. "So if I decide to redirect the assets, can it be done quietly?" "Yes." "How quickly?" "Fairly quickly, depending on the structure." I hesitated, then asked the question that truly changed everything. "What if I wanted the money to actually help people?" Benjamin looked surprised. "What do you mean, I mean real help?" I whispered. "Not luxury vacations, not bigger kitchens, not more greed." My voice cracked. "I want Richard's life to mean something more than this." Benjamin stared at me for a long moment. Then something softened in his expression. "There are organizations that help elderly women abandoned by family," he said carefully. "Housing programs, emergency support services." The words hit me harder than expected. Abandoned by family. The phrase sat heavily in my chest, because deep down, I already felt abandoned too. Benjamin reached into a cabinet and pulled out a brochure from a local support center. Diane Miller Community Outreach Program helping senior women rebuild safe lives. I stared at the photograph on the cover, an older woman smiling weakly while volunteers helped her unpack groceries. Something inside me shifted. Not fully, not yet, but enough. Benjamin watched me carefully. "You're thinking about it." "Yes," I admitted. He folded his hands. "Addie, before you do anything permanent, I need to ask you something honestly." I nodded slowly. "Are you doing this because you're angry I thought about the birthday dinner? The greed? The coldness? The entitlement?" Then I thought about Richard, the man who worked himself into exhaustion to provide for people he loved. And suddenly, tears filled my eyes. "No," I whispered. I looked directly at Benjamin and said the truest thing I had spoken in months. "I'm doing this because I finally understand my children don't value what we sacrifice to give them." The office became very quiet. Benjamin nodded once. Then he opened a fresh legal file and wrote my name across the front. Addison Clark. And that was the moment my final decision officially began. A week after meeting with Benjamin, I drove to the Diane Miller Community Outreach Program for the first time. The building sat on the edge of an older neighborhood outside downtown Columbus. It wasn't fancy. The brick walls were faded, and the sign near the entrance had peeling paint around the edges. But something about the place felt warm, real. I sat in my car, gripping the steering wheel longer than necessary. Part of me still wasn't sure why I had come. Maybe I only wanted perspective. Maybe I needed proof that I wasn't overreacting about my own children. Or maybe deep down, I already knew I was standing at the edge of a decision that would change my entire family forever. A cold wind swept through the parking lot as I finally stepped out of the car. Inside the center smelled faintly like coffee and laundry detergent. The lobby walls were covered with bulletin boards advertising free legal aid counseling services, food assistance, and temporary housing. A young volunteer behind the front desk smiled politely. "Can I help you?" "I'm here to speak with Diane Miller," I said softly. A few minutes later, Diane appeared from a hallway carrying a stack of folders. She looked to be around my age, maybe early 70s, with silver hair pulled into a loose bun and tired but kind eyes. "You must be Addison," she said warmly. Benjamin called. Of course he had. Benjamin always prepared people before throwing them into emotional storms. Diane shook my hand gently. "Come with me." She led me through the building, slowly explaining everything as we walked. Emergency housing, meal programs, medical assistance, support groups for abandoned seniors. The words hit me harder than I expected. Abandoned seniors. I still struggled hearing that phrase without feeling guilty, as if admitting emotional abandonment somehow betrayed my children. Diane opened the door to a common room where several older women sat drinking tea together. Some watched television quietly. Others knitted or played cards. The room looked peaceful at first glance. But then I started noticing things. The sadness in their eyes. The loneliness hiding behind forced smiles. One woman sat near the window, clutching a framed photograph so tightly her knuckles had turned white. Another stared blankly into her coffee cup like she had forgotten where she was. Diane lowered her voice. "Most of these women have families." That surprised me. "They do." She nodded slowly. "Children, grandchildren, sometimes even great-grandchildren. Then why are they here?" Diane's expression darkened with exhaustion. "Because families don't always stay kind." The sentence settled heavily into my chest. One of the women noticed us standing near the doorway and smiled weakly. "You volunteering today?" she asked me. Her name was Gloria. 76 years old, former elementary school teacher, mother of 3, grandmother of 7. While we talked, she showed me photographs of smiling children sitting on Santa's lap during Christmas years ago. "They used to call every week," she said softly. I swallowed hard. "What happened?" Gloria gave a sad little shrug. "Life happened, I guess." But later, while Diane walked me down another hallway, she quietly explained the truth. Gloria's son had convinced her to sign financial documents after her husband died. Within a year, most of her savings were gone. Eventually, her son stopped answering calls entirely. I stopped walking. "You mean he took everything?" Diane's eyes filled with tired understanding. "It happens more often than people realize." My stomach twisted painfully. Suddenly, Ethan's face flashed through my mind. The investment charts, the pressure, the questions about accounts. I felt cold all over. Further down the hallway, I met another woman named Patricia. She had once owned a successful bakery with her husband. Now she slept in temporary housing after her daughter sold her home out from under her during a guardianship dispute. "She said I was confused," Patricia whispered while folding tissues in trembling hands. But I wasn't confused. I was grieving. I nearly stopped breathing when she said that, because for the first time, I realized how easily grief could be weaponized against older people. One accusation, one signature, one courtroom. And suddenly, your entire life could belong to someone else. By lunchtime, I felt emotionally exhausted. Diane brought me coffee in a small office near the back of the building. Neither of us spoke for a while. Finally, I asked quietly, "How do these women survive this?" Diane looked toward the hallway. "Some don't." The honesty of that answer broke my heart. She leaned back in her chair and sighed heavily. "The hardest part isn't losing money," she continued. "It's realizing the people you sacrificed everything for no longer see your humanity. Tears burned behind my eyes instantly, because that was exactly it. Not the money, not the inheritance, the humanity. I thought about my birthday dinner again, the way my children argued about my house while I sat right there listening, as if I were already disappearing. Diane studied me carefully. "You've experienced something similar, haven't you?" For a second, I almost denied it. Mothers are trained to protect their children's image at all costs, even when the children stop protecting us. But something inside me finally cracked open. "Yes," I whispered. And once I started talking, I couldn't stop. I told her about Ethan, Melissa, Jason, the pressure, the entitlement, the fear slowly growing inside me. By the end, tears were sliding down my face uncontrollably. Diane handed me tissues without judgment. Then she said something that changed me forever. "You are allowed to protect yourself, Addison." I stared at her. No one had said those words to me before. Not once. Because mothers are expected to keep giving forever, no matter how much it costs us, no matter how much it destroys us. Diane leaned forward gently. "Loving your children does not require surrendering your dignity." The sentence hit me like sunlight breaking through storm clouds. For months, I had been drowning in guilt. Guilt for doubting my children. Guilt for feeling hurt. Guilt for even considering changing my will. But sitting there in that tiny office surrounded by women who had lost everything, I suddenly realized guilt was exactly what kept people trapped. Diane eventually gave me a tour of the center's newest project, a small housing wing still under renovation. Paint cans lined the hallway. Several rooms remained unfinished due to lack of funding. "We're trying to create permanent transitional housing," she explained, "a safe place for women who've nowhere else to go." I slowly walked through one of the unfinished rooms. Simple bed, small dresser, tiny window overlooking the parking lot. And somehow, it still felt more hopeful than the fear living inside my own house lately. "What happens if funding runs out?" I asked quietly. Diane smiled sadly. "Then we do what we always do." "What's that?" "We pray kindness finds us in time." Those words stayed with me all the way home. That night, I sat alone in Richard's old study again. The house was silent except for the ticking grandfather clock near the staircase. I stared at our family photographs for a long time. Then I imagined something that made my chest ache. What if Richard's money could become shelter instead of greed? What if our life's work could protect people instead of destroying our children? For the first time since Richard died, the answer felt painfully clear. The next morning, I called Benjamin Carter. When he answered, I didn't hesitate. "I'm ready," I told him. There was a long pause. Then he asked quietly, "You're certain?" I looked around my empty kitchen. At the family photos, at the house built by sacrifice and love. And finally, with tears in my eyes, I answered, "Yes." Because deep down, I had already begun giving my money away. Once I made my decision, something strange happened inside me. I became calmer, not happier, not less hurt, but calmer. For months, I had been trapped between guilt and fear, constantly questioning myself. Was I being unfair? Was grief making me paranoid? Was I overreacting to harmless conversations? But after visiting Diane's center, the fog finally cleared. I wasn't imagining anything. My children had slowly begun treating me like an asset instead of a person. And now that I understood the truth, I started noticing things even more clearly, especially Ethan. 2 weeks after I signed the first legal documents with Benjamin, Ethan showed up unexpectedly on a Tuesday afternoon. I was watering flowers on the front porch when his black SUV pulled into the driveway. He stepped out wearing an expensive gray coat, and carrying that same leather briefcase he always brought now. Not once in 40 years had I seen my son bring a briefcase to visit his mother until money entered the conversation. "Mom?" he called warmly. "You should have told me it was this cold outside." I forced a smile. "I'm not fragile, Ethan." He laughed lightly, but his eyes were already scanning the property. The porch, the windows, the roof, calculating. Always calculating. Inside the kitchen, I made coffee while Ethan sat at the table checking emails on his phone. "You're working a lot lately," I said. "Big merger coming up." Silence settled between us. The kind of silence that used to feel comfortable when he was younger. Now it felt tense. Artificial. Finally, Ethan closed his phone and leaned forward. "I've been thinking about you a lot." There it was, the performance voice, gentle, controlled, concerned. I kept stirring cream into my coffee even though it no longer needed stirring. "That's nice." "I mean it, Mom. Ever since Dad passed, I worry about you being alone." I nodded slowly, but said nothing. Ethan reached into his briefcase and pulled out several papers. My chest tightened immediately. "What's that?" "Nothing bad," he said quickly. "Actually, this is for your protection." Of course it was. Everything was always for my protection. He slid the papers toward me. "Power of attorney documents." I stared down at them quietly. "You want control over my finances?" "No," he replied too quickly. "Not control, just assistance. Assistance in case something happens." I looked up slowly. "What exactly do you think is going to happen to me?" Ethan sighed dramatically. "Mom, please don't do this. Do it act like I'm attacking you?" I almost laughed at the irony. He softened his voice further. "You're 68. If there's an emergency, somebody needs legal authority to help manage things." I stared at my son for a long moment, then asked quietly, "Why you?" The question clearly caught him off guard. "What? Why should it be you?" His jaw tightened almost invisibly. "Because I'm the oldest." That's not an answer. For a split second, something cold flashed behind his eyes. Then the mask returned. "I'm financially responsible, Mom." There it was. Not concern. Qualification. Like he was applying for ownership. I slowly pushed the papers back across the table. "I'm not signing anything today." Ethan's smile faded. "You don't trust me. The guilt tactic. Predictable." "I didn't say that, but that's what you mean." I took a slow breath before answering carefully. "I mean, I'd like time to think." Ethan leaned back in his chair, clearly frustrated now. "Mom, people your age get manipulated all the time." The words sent ice through my veins. "People your age." Again. As if my age automatically made me incompetent. "I'm still capable of making decisions," I said quietly. "No one said you weren't." But his tone absolutely did. The conversation died after that. Ethan stayed another 20 minutes, making stiff small talk before finally gathering his papers. At the front door, he paused. "Just remember," he said carefully, "not everybody around you has good intentions." I nearly asked if he realized how ironic that sounded. Instead, I simply nodded. The second his SUV disappeared down the street, I locked the front door and leaned against it trembling. Not from fear, from heartbreak. Because for the first time, I truly believed Ethan saw himself as the future owner of my life. And somehow, things only got worse from there. Melissa began calling constantly, sometimes twice a day. At first, she sounded unusually affectionate. "You've been on my mind all morning. I miss you. You should let me come organize the house for you." But underneath every conversation sat the same invisible question. How much money do you still control? One evening, she invited herself over for dinner. She arrived carrying soup and a fake smile. You look tired, she said immediately after walking in. I'm fine. No, really. You do. Something about the comment unsettled me deeply. Throughout dinner, she kept watching me too carefully, studying me, analyzing me. At one point, she casually asked, Have you been forgetting things lately? I nearly dropped my spoon. What? Oh, nothing serious, she said quickly. You repeated yourself on the phone yesterday. I stared at her. I had not repeated myself. Not once. The realization hit slowly and horribly. She was testing a narrative, planting doubt. The same exact thing Patricia from Diane's center had warned me about. I suddenly felt cold all over. Later that evening, Melissa wandered into Richard's old study while I cleaned dishes. When I walked in behind her, she was staring directly at the filing cabinet where Richard and I once kept financial records. Oh, she said quickly. I was just looking for a pen. A pen, in a locked file cabinet. I smiled politely anyway. The acting exhausted me now. Then came Jason. Jason didn't manipulate quietly like Ethan or Melissa. Jason exploded. He arrived drunk one Friday night, just after 10 o'clock. The second I opened the door, I smelled alcohol. Jason. I need help. He interrupted immediately. I stepped aside reluctantly. His eyes looked bloodshot, exhausted, desperate. For one dangerous moment, my heart softened. Because despite everything, he was still my son. He collapsed heavily onto the couch and buried his face in his hands. I'm screwed, Mom. I sat carefully across from him. What happened? The garage deal fell apart. I closed my eyes briefly. Of course it did. I owe people money. How much? Jason hesitated, then whispered, almost 80,000. The number hit me like a slap. Jason, I know. His voice cracked. I know. For several seconds, neither of us spoke. Then he looked up at me with tears in his eyes. You could fix this. There it was again. Not help. Fix. As if my money existed specifically to rescue him from consequences. I can't keep solving your problems, I whispered. Jason's entire face changed instantly. Anger replaced sadness so quickly it frightened me. So that's it. That's not what I said. You have millions sitting in the bank. I have retirement savings. You have more money than you could spend in 10 lifetimes. His voice echoed through the house. I felt myself shaking. Lower your voice. No, he shouted. Dad would never turn his back on me like this. The sentence sliced through me like a knife, because he knew exactly where to hurt me. I stood slowly from my chair. Your father also wouldn't want you drinking yourself into debt. Jason stared at me with pure resentment. Then he said something I will never forget for the rest of my life. You care more about your money than your own children. The silence afterward felt unbearable, because deep down, I realized my children truly believed my money already belonged to them. And that terrified me more than anything else. That night after Jason left, I sat alone in the dark house, listening to the grandfather clock tick through the silence. Then, I finally admitted something to myself that I had been avoiding for months. My children were no longer asking for love. They were demanding ownership, and I knew the storm was only beginning. 3 days after Jason screamed at me in my living room, Ethan called again. His voice sounded unusually cheerful. Mom, I was thinking maybe we could have lunch together tomorrow. I almost said no immediately, but something stopped me. Maybe curiosity, maybe instinct, Or maybe some small, broken part of me still hoped my son might finally speak to me like a human being instead of a financial opportunity. So, I agreed. The next morning, Ethan picked me up in his SUV around 11. Rain tapped softly against the windows as we drove through downtown Columbus. For the first few minutes, the conversation stayed harmless. Traffic, weather, a new restaurant opening near his office. But Ethan seemed distracted, tense. He kept checking the dashboard clock every few seconds. "You seem busy?" I said carefully. "Just a packed day." He forced a smile. "I appreciate you coming with me." "With you where?" He glanced at me quickly. "To the bank." My stomach tightened instantly. "The bank?" "Relax, Mom." He laughed lightly. "I just need to stop there for a few minutes. Then we'll grab lunch afterward." I should have trusted my instincts right then. But mothers spend their entire lives trying to believe the best about their children, even when the evidence hurts. The bank sat inside a modern glass building downtown. Ethan parked near the entrance and hurried around to open my door like an attentive son. The performance had become almost impressive at this point. Inside, everything smelled like polished marble and expensive perfume. A young banker greeted Ethan immediately. "Good afternoon, Mr. Clark." So, this had been arranged beforehand. Of course it had. Ethan placed a hand lightly against my back as he guided me toward one of the private offices. "This won't take long." I said nothing. The banker introduced herself as Amanda and smiled warmly at me. "It's lovely to meet you, Mrs. Clark." I nodded politely. For several minutes, Ethan handled most of the talking. Too much talking. He explained how concerned he was about me managing finances alone. How overwhelming estate planning could become. How older clients often benefited from family support structures. Every sentence sounded carefully rehearsed. Amanda finally turned toward me. "And how are you feeling about everything, Mrs. Clark?" There was something genuine in her tone, something observant. I suddenly realized she was studying me very carefully, probably trained to, because elderly financial abuse happens every day in places exactly like this. Before I could answer, Ethan jumped in smoothly. "My mother's been under a lot of stress since Dad passed. Stress, not grief, not heartbreak. Stress. Like I was some unstable client slowly becoming unreliable." Amanda nodded professionally. "That's completely understandable." Then Ethan pulled several forms from his folder. There they were again. The same documents from my kitchen table. Power of attorney. Account access authorization. Signature lines already marked with yellow tabs. My pulse began pounding hard in my ears. "Ethan," I said quietly, "I told you I wasn't ready to sign these." His smile tightened instantly. "We're just discussing options." "No," I replied calmly. "You brought me here to sign them." Amanda's eyes flicked between us. The room suddenly felt much colder. Ethan lowered his voice clearly, trying to maintain control. "Mom, please don't make this difficult." Difficult? The word hit me strangely, as if protecting myself had become an inconvenience. I slowly folded my hands in my lap. "I'm not signing anything today." For a moment, Ethan simply stared at me. Then something shifted in his face. Not anger yet, frustration. The kind of frustration people feel when a transaction goes wrong. He leaned forward. "Mom, this isn't smart." Amanda spoke carefully. "Mrs. Clark has every right to take more time." Ethan barely acknowledged her. "You don't understand how complicated these things can become," he said to me. "I understand perfectly fine. Do you?" His tone sharpened slightly. "Because lately, you've been acting paranoid." The word stunned me. Paranoid. There it was. The narrative Melissa had started planting. I looked directly at my son. You think I'm paranoid? I think grief is affecting your judgment. Amanda shifted uncomfortably beside us. I suddenly noticed her expression changing. Concern. Real concern. Not about me. About Ethan. He realized it too late. His voice softened immediately. Mom, I'm only trying to protect the family. Protect the family. As if I somehow stood outside it now? I looked down at the paperwork quietly, then asked the question that had been growing inside me for months. Protect the family or protect the money? The silence afterward was deafening. Ethan's jaw tightened. Amanda looked away awkwardly, and in that moment the mask finally slipped. Not completely. Just enough. You're being emotional, Ethan muttered. I stared at him in disbelief. Emotional? After carrying him for 9 months. After working double shifts to pay for his college tuition. After sitting beside hospital beds during childhood fevers. Now, I was simply emotional. I slowly pushed the papers back across the desk. No. Ethan blinked. What? No, I repeated calmly. I will not sign anything. The temperature in the room seemed to drop instantly. For several seconds, Ethan said nothing. Then his entire demeanor changed. The warmth vanished. The patience vanished. All that remained was irritation. You're making a mistake. Amanda finally stepped in gently. Mr. Clark, perhaps this discussion would be better continued another day. Ethan ignored her completely. You have no idea how vulnerable you are right now. I felt something inside me harden. Not anger. Clarity. I'm vulnerable because my children think my life belongs to them. The sentence landed harder than I expected. Even Amanda looked startled. Ethan stared at me like he no longer recognized who I was. Then suddenly he laughed once under his breath, coldly. You know what your problem is, I didn't answer. You're wasting money that should stay in the family. The words echoed through the office. And just like that, everything became painfully clear. Not concern, not love, ownership. That was all this had ever been about. Amanda looked genuinely alarmed now. Mr. Clark. But Ethan stood abruptly, grabbing the papers off the desk. Forget it. He shoved the folder back into his briefcase aggressively. I remained seated. Calm. Too calm, actually. Because the worst part wasn't hearing the sentence. It was realizing he truly believed it. He believed my money already belonged to him. Amanda turned toward me gently. Mrs. Clark, are you all right? I looked at her kind eyes and nearly cried from relief. Because a stranger had shown me more respect in 10 minutes than my own son had shown me in months. Yes, I whispered. I think I finally am. Ethan drove me home in silence. The tension inside the SUV felt suffocating. Halfway there, he suddenly spoke without looking at me. Has someone been influencing you? I almost laughed. No, this doesn't sound like you. That sentence stayed with me. Because what he really meant was, this doesn't sound like the version of you I can control. When we reached my house, Ethan cut the engine, but didn't unlock the doors immediately. You're pushing your family away, he said quietly. I looked out the windshield toward the front porch Richard built with his own hands. Then I answered softly, No, Ethan. My family walked away a long time ago. For one brief second, something almost human flickered across his face. Guilt, maybe, or shame. But it disappeared quickly. He unlocked the doors. I stepped out without another word. Inside the house, I stood alone in the hallway, listening to the silence settle around me. Then slowly, I walked into Richard's old study and opened the locked drawer containing my updated legal paperwork. I stared down at the transfer confirmations, the charitable trust documents, The signatures already finalized. Most of the money was gone now, protected, untouchable, and for the first time in months, I finally felt safe. Because while my children were still fighting over my money, they had no idea I had already begun taking it away from them. A few nights after the bank incident, I couldn't sleep again. Rain tapped softly against the bedroom windows, while the grandfather clock downstairs counted each passing hour like a slow heartbeat. 2 in the morning, then 3, then nearly 4. I finally gave up pretending rest would come and wandered downstairs wrapped in Richard's old gray cardigan. The house felt unbearably quiet, not peaceful, empty. I made tea I didn't really want and sat at the kitchen table staring at the dark hallway leading toward Richard's study. That room had become dangerous lately. Every time I entered it, memories found me waiting. His laugh, his voice, the way he used to hum while balancing checkbooks at the desk. Sometimes grief softens with time, other times it sharpens. That night, it cut straight through me. Without fully thinking about why, I walked into the study and opened the bottom drawer of Richard's desk. Inside sat a stack of unused stationery embossed with our old family address. Richard bought it years ago because he believed handwritten letters mattered. People save letters, he used to say. Nobody saves text messages. I slowly carried the stationery back to the kitchen table. Then I began writing. Not legal documents, not instructions, letters. One for each of my children. At first, I didn't know what I planned to say. But once the pen touched paper, the words poured out of me like a wound finally opening. I started with Ethan. Dear Ethan, do you remember the winter your father worked 18 days straight because your school trip to Washington, D.C. cost more than we could afford? You cried because you thought you wouldn't get to go with your classmates. Your father sold his fishing boat for that trip. You never knew. Tears blurred my vision immediately. I stopped writing for a moment and pressed trembling fingers against my mouth. Because Ethan truly never knew. Richard never wanted the children carrying guilt over sacrifice. Neither did I. Maybe that was our mistake? Maybe children should know exactly what love costs. I continued writing slowly. You were 12 years old when I took a second job cleaning offices at night so we could help pay for your college savings account. I used to come home at 2 in the morning and still wake up at 6 to make your breakfast before school. I never regretted it. Not once. But somewhere along the way, you stopped seeing me as your mother and started seeing me as a responsibility to manage. That sentence hurt so much, I nearly crossed it out. But I left it there. Because it was true. By sunrise, Ethan's letter was 6 pages long. Melissa's took even longer. Dear Melissa, when you were little, you used to crawl into my lap every time thunderstorms scared you. You said my voice made the world feel safe. I still remember the pink blanket you dragged everywhere until it fell apart. I remember every dance recital, every heartbreak, every fever. I remember holding your hand when you gave birth to Olivia because you were terrified something would go wrong. You once told me I was your best friend. What happened to us? That question nearly shattered me. Because unlike Ethan's cold ambition or Jason's explosive anger, Melissa's betrayal felt quieter, more personal somehow. She knew how to sound loving while slowly dismantling my dignity piece by piece. Her false concern hurt worse because part of me kept wanting to believe it was real. Jason's letter was the hardest of all. I stared at blank paper for nearly 20 minutes before writing a single word. Dear Jason, your father adored you, even during your worst mistakes, especially during your worst mistakes. You were always the child who needed the most rescuing, and maybe we rescued you too many times. Maybe every time we protected you from consequences, We accidentally taught you someone else would always clean up the damage. My tears dropped onto the paper then. I remembered Jason at 6 years old, running through sprinklers in the backyard. Jason at 16, crying after his first breakup. Jason asleep against Richard's shoulder during long car rides. How does a mother reconcile those memories with the angry man screaming about inheritance in her living room? I still don't know. The sun had fully risen by the time I finished the letters. 3 envelopes sat on the kitchen table beside my cold tea. None addressed, none sealed. I wasn't ready for that. Maybe part of me never would be. Around noon, the front doorbell rang unexpectedly. I quickly wiped my eyes before answering. Olivia stood there holding a paper grocery bag and wearing oversized scrubs from the pediatric clinic. The second she saw my face, concern flooded her expression. "Grandma? Have you been crying?" I almost lied. Instead, I stepped aside quietly. Olivia entered carefully, like someone walking into sacred space. "I brought soup," she said softly. "And those little blueberry muffins you like." Something about that nearly broke me. Not because of the food, because she remembered. No one else remembered small things anymore. Not Ethan, not Melissa, not Jason, just Olivia. While she unpacked groceries in the kitchen, I quickly gathered the letters and slid them beneath a magazine on the table. But Olivia noticed anyway. "What's that?" "Oh," I said quickly, "nothing important." She didn't push further. That was another difference between Olivia and the rest of the family. She respected silence. After lunch, she helped me trim dead flowers in the backyard garden. The afternoon sunlight painted soft gold across the fence Richard built years ago. For the first time in weeks, I felt calm. Not because my problems disappeared, but because someone sat beside me without asking for anything. At one point, Olivia glanced toward the house. "Mom called me yesterday." My hands paused over the roses. "Oh, she said you've been acting strange lately?" There it was again, the narrative. Strange, confused, emotional. The groundwork was spreading through the family now. I forced myself to stay calm. "And what do you think?" Olivia looked genuinely confused by the question. "I think you're hurt." Simple, honest, accurate, not unstable, not irrational, just hurt. Tears filled my eyes so suddenly I had to look away. Olivia immediately set down her gardening gloves. "Grandma?" I shook my head quickly. "I'm all right," but I wasn't. Because hearing one person finally see the truth after months of emotional manipulation felt overwhelming. Olivia moved closer and gently squeezed my hand. "You know something," she said softly. "What you don't have to keep proving your worth to people who only show up when they need something." I stared at her in shock, because somehow, at 24 years old, my granddaughter understood what it had taken me nearly 70 years to learn. That evening, after Olivia left, I returned to the kitchen table and reread the letters. Page after page of memories, sacrifice, love, pain. I realized then that I wasn't really writing to my children. I was writing to the versions of them I had lost. The little boy who once held my hand crossing streets. The little girl who thought thunderstorms disappeared when I hugged her. The little boy who used to fall asleep against my shoulder. Those children were gone now, and maybe I had to finally accept that. Slowly, I folded each letter and placed them back into the envelopes. Then I locked them inside Richard's desk. Not sent, not destroyed, just waiting, like the last pieces of a family that no longer knew how to speak honestly to each other. And deep down, I already sensed something terrible was coming. Because my children still believed they were fighting over money that belonged to them. They had no idea how much had already changed. The family meeting happened on a Sunday. Of course it did. Richard always believed Sundays were sacred family days. Growing up, the children knew that no matter how busy life became, Sunday dinner meant everyone came home. I think that's why what happened that afternoon hurt so deeply. Because they took something Richard loved and turned it into a negotiation over my death. Ethan called me 3 days earlier. "We should all sit down together," he said carefully. "There's tension in the family, and it's becoming unhealthy." The irony nearly made me laugh. Tension. As if greed were just unfortunate miscommunication. I almost refused, but Benjamin advised me to stay calm and let them reveal themselves completely. "People eventually expose their real intentions," he told me quietly over the phone. "Especially when money is involved." So, Sunday afternoon, I cooked dinner again. Not because anyone deserved it, because some habits live too deeply inside mothers to disappear overnight. By 4 o'clock, the roast chicken sat warming in the oven. Mashed potatoes steamed on the stove. Fresh rolls cooled beneath a kitchen towel. I moved through the house, slowly listening to the familiar silence. For a moment, I imagined Richard standing behind me. He would have hated this. Not the argument itself, the disrespect. Richard could tolerate almost anything except cruelty toward family. At exactly 5 o'clock, Ethan arrived. Right on time. Always controlled. Always prepared. He walked into the house carrying a slim leather folder tucked beneath his arm. That alone told me everything. This wasn't a family dinner. This was a business meeting. Melissa arrived next, tense and overly cheerful. Jason showed up last again, though thankfully sober this time. Olivia came too quietly, slipping into the kitchen to help me carry dishes without being asked. "You don't have to do all this yourself," she whispered gently. I smiled weakly. Yes, I do. Dinner itself felt unbearable. Nobody fought openly at first, but underneath every conversation sat tension thick enough to choke on. Ethan barely touched his food. Melissa kept glancing nervously between everyone. Jason drank too quickly. Only Olivia acted normal. At one point, she started talking about a little girl from the pediatric clinic who insisted on wearing superhero capes to every appointment. For 30 beautiful seconds, the table actually laughed. Real laughter, human laughter. Then Ethan cleared his throat, and everything died again. "I think we should discuss some important things." There it was. The meeting had officially begun. I slowly placed my fork down. Jason leaned back heavily in his chair. Finally. Melissa shot him a warning glance. Ethan opened the leather folder calmly. "I've been trying to avoid conflict." He began using the same polished corporate tone he used at the bank, "but we need clarity moving forward." Clarity. Such cold language for something so personal. I said nothing. Ethan continued. "Mom's getting older. Older. Never Addison. Never Mom. Just older. She shouldn't have to manage everything alone." Melissa nodded carefully. "We're worried about you." "No," I thought silently. "You're worried about my money." Jason crossed his arms. "Can we stop pretending this isn't about the inheritance?" The word landed heavily across the table. Inheritance. Olivia looked horrified. Melissa sighed dramatically. "Jason," what he snapped. "Everybody's already thinking it." Ethan rubbed his forehead impatiently. "This is exactly why we need structure." Then he turned toward me directly. "Mom, have you updated your estate plan?" The room became completely silent. Even the grandfather clock in the hallway suddenly sounded louder. Tick, tick, tick. I folded my napkin carefully before answering. "Yes." 3 pairs of eyes locked onto me instantly. Ethan leaned forward slightly. "With Benjamin?" "Yes." Jason spoke next. So what happens with the house? Straight to it. Not, how are you? Not, what do you want? The house. I looked around the dining room slowly. The same room where Richard taught Ethan how to carve Thanksgiving turkey. The same room where Melissa blew out birthday candles every year. The same room where Jason once spilled grape juice across the wallpaper and cried for an hour because he thought I'd stop loving him. And now they sat there discussing it like property inventory. Melissa forced a small smile. We just want to avoid confusion later. Again with that word. Confusion. I looked directly at her. There seems to be very little confusion about what all of you want. Nobody answered. Jason finally broke the silence. Well, somebody should get the house. Ethan immediately responded. It should stay in the family. Jason laughed bitterly. You mean with you? At least I could maintain it. Oh, please. You just want the property value? Melissa jumped in quickly. Maybe we should sell it and divide everything evenly. Evenly. Such an ugly word sometimes. Because love is never divided evenly. Sacrifice isn't measured evenly. Parenthood certainly isn't. Jason pointed toward Melissa. You'd sell this place in a week, and you'd probably refinance it to pay gambling debts, Ethan shot back. I don't gamble. You lose money on literally everything else. Go to hell. Boys, stop it, Melissa snapped. Then she turned toward me with practiced concern. Mom, this fighting is exactly why you need to make your wishes clear. There it was again. Not grief, not love. Management. Control. I stayed silent intentionally. Benjamin had been right. People reveal themselves when allowed enough space, and my children were revealing everything. Ethan opened his folder again. I actually drafted a potential distribution outline. My stomach nearly turned. You drafted what a fair structure, he replied calmly. Just as a starting point, he slid papers across the table. Actual percentages, asset categories, property projections, my entire life reduced to spreadsheets. Olivia stared at the documents in disbelief. Are you serious right now? Ethan ignored her. Jason grabbed one page angrily. What the hell is this? You're not financially stable, Ethan replied coldly. Naturally, there would need to be protections. Jason shot to his feet instantly. Protections you'd burn through your share in 6 months? At least I'm honest about wanting money. Melissa stood abruptly too. Oh my God, stop yelling! And suddenly, the entire room exploded. Jason shouting, Ethan arguing back, Melissa crying dramatically, voices crashing into each other until none of it even sounded human anymore. Just noise, greed, entitlement, hunger. And through all of it, nobody asked what I wanted. Nobody asked what mattered to me. Nobody asked whether I was hurting listening to my own children divide my existence into percentages. Then Ethan said the sentence that finally broke whatever remained inside me. We deserve transparency, Mom. Deserve. I stared at my son in disbelief. You deserve transparency? Yes, he said firmly. We're your children. The room fell silent again, and for the first time in months, I felt no confusion at all, only clarity. I slowly stood from the table. My hands trembled slightly, but my voice remained calm. You want transparency? Ethan nodded carefully. Yes. I looked at each of my children, one by one, at their tense faces, their hungry eyes, their fear of losing something they already believed belonged to them. Then I said quietly, all right. The room froze, because none of them understood yet that I was finally about to tell them the truth. The silence after I said, all right, felt almost electric. For one brief moment, nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Even Jason sat back down, slowly, eyes narrowed in confusion. Ethan was the first to recover. He straightened slightly in his chair, clearly believing he had finally pushed me into cooperation. "Good," he said carefully. "I think honesty is best for everyone. Honesty." I almost smiled at that, because honesty was exactly what they were about to get. I remained standing at the head of the dining table, staring down at my children. For the first time in months, I wasn't afraid of them. Heartbroken. Yes. Still grieving the family we used to be? Absolutely. But afraid? No. Because somewhere along the way, grief had burned away my denial, and clarity is a powerful thing. I folded my hands together carefully. "You want transparency?" I repeated quietly. "So let's be transparent." Ethan nodded once. Melissa looked nervous now. Jason impatient. Olivia sat completely still, watching me with concern. I took a slow breath. "Several months ago, I met with Benjamin Carter." Ethan's jaw tightened instantly. Of course it did. Because he already suspected Benjamin was involved somehow. I updated my estate planning documents. I continued. Melissa swallowed hard. Jason crossed his arms again. "How much are we talking about exactly?" he interrupted. Olivia looked disgusted. "Jason." "No," I said softly, stopping her. "Let him speak, because I wanted them to hear themselves clearly." Jason looked directly at me. "We deserve to know where things stand." Again, with deserve. I nodded slowly. "Then I'll tell you." I walked toward Richard's old study while every eye followed me. Inside the desk drawer sat a slim blue folder containing copies of finalized transfer documents, trust agreements, asset transfers, charitable foundation records. My hands trembled slightly as I carried it back into the dining room. Not because I doubted my decision, because I knew this moment would permanently change my family forever. I sat down slowly and placed the folder on the table. Ethan immediately leaned forward. "What is that? My final decisions?" The room grew still again. I opened the folder carefully. "Over the last several months," I said calmly, "I transferred the majority of my financial assets into a charitable trust." Nobody reacted at first. The words almost seemed too large for them to process. Then Jason blinked. "What?" Melissa frowned. "What kind of trust?" I looked directly at them. "A housing and support foundation for elderly women who've been abandoned or financially abused by their families." The silence afterward felt endless. Ethan stared at me blankly. Jason actually laughed once under his breath like he'd misheard me. Then he said, "You're joking." "I'm not." Melissa's face went pale. "How much money are you talking about?" I answered honestly. "Most of it." The explosion happened instantly. "What do you mean, most of it?" Jason shouted. Ethan grabbed the folder off the table aggressively and started flipping through pages. "No," he muttered. "No, no, no." Melissa looked like she might faint. "You gave away our inheritance, there it was. Not your money, not Dad's life savings. Our inheritance." I looked at her quietly. "It was never yours." Jason slammed both hands against the table. "Are you insane?" Olivia gasped softly. "Jason," but he was already spiraling. "You gave millions to strangers." "They aren't strangers," I replied calmly. "They're people who needed help. We needed help." I stared at him in disbelief. "You needed $80,000 to cover bad decisions. I'm your son, and I'm still your mother." I snapped suddenly. The force in my own voice shocked even me. The room froze instantly, because for months I had stayed quiet, gentle, careful. But something inside me finally broke open. I looked directly at all three of my children. "Do you know what none of you asked tonight?" Nobody answered. You never asked whether I was happy? Silence. You never asked what mattered to me. Melissa started crying softly, but I kept going. You sat in this house and argued over my money while I was still alive. Ethan finally looked up from the papers, furious now. You made this decision emotionally. No, I replied calmly. I made it after months of clarity. You were manipulated. The accusation hit exactly as Benjamin predicted. I nodded slowly. There it is. Ethan's voice sharpened. Mom, this is exactly why major financial decisions shouldn't be made during grief. I almost laughed from disbelief. Grief, I whispered. You think grief made me do this? Yes. No, Ethan. My voice shook now. Your behavior made me do this. That landed hard. For a split second, guilt flickered across Melissa's face. Jason just looked enraged. Ethan remained cold, controlled, dangerously controlled. He slid the paperwork back onto the table. This can be challenged. The sentence chilled the entire room. Olivia looked horrified. You're threatening Grandma? I'm protecting this family, Ethan snapped. No, I said quietly. You're protecting money. His expression hardened immediately. That money belonged to Dad, too. And your father would be ashamed of this conversation. The words cut through him visibly. Good. For once, I wanted them to hurt. Just a fraction of what they had done to me. Melissa wiped tears from her cheeks. How could you do this to us? The question stunned me. To us. Not once had she considered what they had done to me. I looked at my daughter carefully. Do you remember my birthday dinner? Her face changed instantly. That's not fair. You argued about my death in front of me. We were trying to plan responsibly. No, I interrupted softly. You were dividing my life like property. Jason suddenly shoved his chair backward violently. This is unbelievable. He started pacing the dining room. You'd rather give money to strangers than your own children. I looked at him sadly. I'd rather help people who still understand gratitude. That hit him like a slap. Wow. He laughed bitterly. Wow. Olivia finally spoke quietly. Grandma, are you okay? And there it was, the only real question anyone had asked me all night. Tears instantly filled my eyes. Because after everything, only Olivia still saw me as human. I think I finally will be, I whispered. Ethan stood abruptly. This isn't over. The threat hung heavily in the room. Melissa looked terrified now. Jason furious. But strangely, I felt calm. Not because I enjoyed hurting my children. God knows I didn't. Every second of this felt like mourning people who were still alive. But deep down, I also knew something undeniable. For the first time in months, the truth was finally sitting openly at the table. No pretending, no fake concern, no manipulative kindness. Just truth. And the truth was ugly. Ethan stared at me coldly. You chose strangers over your own family. I looked directly into my son's eyes, then answered with the deepest honesty I had left no Ethan. My voice trembled softly. I chose people who still remember how to love. The room fell completely silent, and somewhere deep inside myself, I realized there was no going back anymore. The room stayed silent for several long seconds after I said it. I chose people who still remember how to love. Nobody moved. Nobody spoke. Then Ethan laughed once, coldly. Not because anything was funny, because he was angry enough to stop pretending. You've lost perspective, he said quietly. Perspective. Such a polished word for disrespect. I sat calmly at the dining table while my children stared at me like I had betrayed them. Not one of them seemed heartbroken over losing me. Only over losing money. That realization settled heavily into my chest. Melissa finally spoke through tears. "Mom? Please tell me this isn't finalized." I looked at her carefully. "It is." Jason cursed under his breath and started pacing again. No, there's no way this is legal." "It's legal," I replied softly. Ethan immediately looked up. "You already transferred the funds." "Yes? How much enough?" His jaw tightened violently. "Answer the question." For a moment, I saw something in my oldest son I had never truly seen before. Not concern, not sadness, panic. Real panic. Because the money he already imagined controlling was gone. "I transferred the majority of the liquid assets several months ago," I said carefully. "The trust is active and legally protected." Jason slammed his hand against the wall. "You had no right." That sentence stunned me. "No right." I looked directly at him. "No right to decide what happens to my own money. You know what I mean?" "No," I said quietly. "I don't think I do." Ethan suddenly stood up. "We need Benjamin involved immediately." I almost smiled. He already is. The room went still again. Then, almost as if summoned by the tension itself, the front doorbell rang. Everyone froze. I already knew who it was. Benjamin Carter entered the house carrying a slim black briefcase and wearing his dark wool coat. The moment Ethan saw him, his face hardened instantly. "You." Benjamin closed the door calmly behind him. "Good evening, Ethan." Jason pointed angrily. "You helped her do this." Benjamin's expression remained completely composed. "I helped Addison execute her legal wishes." Melissa wiped tears from her cheeks. She wasn't thinking clearly. Benjamin looked directly at her. Yes, she was. The firmness in his voice cut through the room immediately. Ethan stepped forward. She made major financial decisions while emotionally compromised. Benjamin didn't flinch. I anticipated that accusation. That sentence made the entire room tense. Benjamin calmly opened his briefcase and removed several documents. Medical evaluations, signed competency certifications, witness statements, dates, legal records, every possible safeguard. He laid them neatly across the dining table. Prior to all transfers, Benjamin explained calmly, Addison underwent full cognitive and psychological evaluations by independent physicians. Jason stared in disbelief. "You're kidding." "No," Benjamin continued. "She was found fully competent, mentally sound, and legally capable of making all financial decisions independently." Ethan grabbed one of the papers aggressively. "This is ridiculous." "No," Benjamin replied quietly. "This is thorough." For the first time that evening, I watched uncertainty flicker across Ethan's face. Not guilt, fear, because his strategy was collapsing in real time. Melissa looked completely overwhelmed now. "You actually thought we'd accuse you of being mentally unstable?" Nobody answered her, because we all knew the truth. Yes, they would have. Benjamin slowly turned toward Ethan. "In fact," he said carefully, "your mother specifically requested competency evaluations because she feared family members might attempt legal challenges." The sentence landed like a bomb. Ethan's face darkened instantly. "You painted us as predators?" I spoke before Benjamin could answer. "No, Ethan." My voice shook softly. "You painted yourselves that way." Silence swallowed the room again. Jason rubbed both hands over his face aggressively. "This is insane." Benjamin looked at him calmly. "No. What's insane is pressuring a grieving widow to surrender control of her finances." Jason glared at him. You don't know anything about this family. Benjamin's expression changed then. For the first time all night, real anger appeared in his eyes. I knew your father for 40 years. The room fell quiet immediately. Benjamin took a slow breath before continuing. Richard Clark worked himself half to death building security for this family. Not entitlement. Those words hit all three of my children visibly. Good. Someone finally needed to say it aloud. Melissa started crying harder. I never wanted this. I looked at her sadly. Then why did you keep asking about my money? Her mouth opened slightly, then closed again. No answer, because there wasn't one. Jason turned toward me again. So what now? He snapped bitterly. You just leave us with nothing. Nothing. The word echoed painfully through me. Nothing. As if love, education, opportunities, decades of sacrifice, and a lifetime of support somehow counted for nothing because there was less money left waiting afterward. I suddenly felt exhausted beyond words. I gave you everything for 40 years, I whispered. Nobody responded. Tears burned behind my eyes. I missed sleep, vacations, dreams, time with your father. We built our entire lives around giving all three of you better futures. My voice cracked. And somehow, all any of you can talk about is what else you deserve. Melissa looked down at the floor. Jason avoided eye contact. Only Ethan remained rigid, cold, calculating. Then he asked the question I think he had been holding back all night. How much is left? The bluntness of it stunned even Benjamin. I stared at my son. Even now, even after all this, still money, still numbers, still assets. Not one apology, not one expression of remorse, just calculation. There's enough for me to live comfortably, I replied quietly. That's not what I asked. I know. The silence between us felt sharp enough to cut skin. Finally, Olivia spoke, very softly. Mom, Uncle Ethan, Uncle Jason. Everyone looked toward her. Tears filled her eyes now too. She's still Grandma. God, that sentence nearly destroyed me. Because in an entire room filled with my own children, only my granddaughter still saw me as a person first. Melissa began sobbing openly then. Not dramatic crying. Real crying, messy, ashamed. For one brief second, I thought maybe something inside her was finally breaking open. But Ethan remained unmoved. He slowly gathered copies of the legal documents into a neat stack. This changes things, he said flatly. Benjamin nodded calmly. Yes, it does. Ethan looked directly at me. You've permanently damaged this family. That sentence hurt. Not because it was true, because part of me still feared it might be. I stared at my son for several long seconds before answering. No, Ethan. My voice barely rose above a whisper. This family was damaged long before I changed my will. The room fell silent one final time, and deep down, I think every single person at that table knew I was right. After Benjamin left that night, the house felt colder than ever. Not physically, emotionally, like something sacred had finally shattered beyond repair. Nobody spoke for several minutes after the front door closed behind him. The dining room remained frozen in silence. Half-eaten food sat untouched on plates. Wine glasses reflected the dim kitchen lights. The remains of what used to be family dinners. Jason finally grabbed his jacket aggressively. This is unbelievable, he muttered. Then he looked directly at me. You chose strangers over your own blood. I was too emotionally exhausted to argue anymore. I chose kindness, I replied quietly. Jason laughed bitterly. Good luck with that. Then he stormed toward the front door and slammed it hard enough to shake the framed photographs on the hallway wall. The sound echoed through the house long after he was gone. Melissa still sat at the table crying softly into tissues. Part of me wanted to comfort her automatically. That old maternal instinct still lived inside me no matter how much pain she caused. But another part of me finally understood something important. Mothers cannot heal wounds their children keep choosing to create. Ethan remained standing near the window, staring out into the darkness. Completely emotionless. Or at least pretending to be. That frightened me more than Jason's anger ever could. Because rage eventually burns out, coldness doesn't. Finally, Ethan turned around. There's still the house. The sentence hit me like a punch to the chest. Not because of the house itself, because even now, after everything, he still came back to assets, to ownership, to inheritance. Olivia looked horrified. Uncle Ethan, what he snapped sharply, it matters. Then he looked directly at me. What happens to the property? I closed my eyes briefly. Here it was. The final piece, the last illusion they were still holding on to. I slowly stood from the table and walked toward the living room fireplace. Above it hung my favorite photograph of Richard. Smiling, sunburned, holding a fish during a lake trip 30 years ago. He looked so alive in that picture, so full of hope. I stared at his face before speaking. This house won't belong to any of you after I die. The silence afterward felt suffocating. Melissa slowly lowered her tissue. What? I turned back toward them carefully. I already signed the property transfer documents. For the first time all evening, Ethan genuinely looked shocked. You transferred the house too? Yes. To who? Melissa whispered. I swallowed hard. The foundation. Nobody moved. Nobody even breathed. I continued softly. After my death, this home will become transitional housing for elderly women, abandoned by their families. Jason may have exploded earlier, but Ethan's reaction now felt somehow worse, because his anger arrived quietly, dangerously quietly. You gave away our childhood home. No, that wasn't what I did. I saved it, but I could already see none of them would ever understand that. I looked around the living room slowly. Richard's books still lined the shelves. Family photos covered every wall. The piano Melissa once practiced on still sat near the staircase. This house held decades of love inside it, and I refused to let it become another trophy in a war over money. It will still be a home, I whispered. Melissa stared at me in disbelief. For strangers, for women who need safety. Jason laughed harshly from near the doorway. So that's it. Dad works his whole life for this family, and you hand everything away. The comment hit something deep inside me. I walked slowly toward him. Your father worked his whole life because he believed family meant protecting people. Jason looked away first. Not me. For the first time in months, not me. Then Ethan asked the question I knew was coming. Who's managing all of this? I hesitated, because this part mattered, maybe more than anything else. Finally, I answered quietly. Olivia. The room froze completely. Olivia's eyes widened instantly. What Melissa stood abruptly. You put Olivia in charge? It's temporary oversight alongside the board, I explained softly. She'll help supervise operations and community outreach. Melissa looked blindsided. You discussed this with my daughter before me? No, Olivia said quickly. I had no idea. And she truly looked stunned. That mattered to me. Because unlike everyone else in this room, Olivia had never asked for anything. Not once. Ethan rubbed his jaw slowly. So let me get this straight. His voice had gone frighteningly calm. You cut your own children out of the estate and handed authority to a 24-year-old girl. I looked directly at him. I handed responsibility to the only person in this family who still shows kindness without expecting payment. That sentence landed hard. Melissa burst into tears again. This is humiliating. No, I replied softly. What's humiliating is fighting over your mother's money while she's still alive. Nobody answered, because nobody could. Olivia suddenly looked overwhelmed. Grandma, I don't know if I can do something like this. I walked over and gently held her hands. Yes, you can. Her eyes filled with tears instantly. You see people, I whispered. That matters more than money ever will. The room stayed silent again. Then Melissa suddenly spoke through tears. You really think we're horrible people now? The question hurt because part of me wished the answer were simpler. I think grief and money brought out the worst parts of all of us. Even myself, especially myself. Because despite everything, I still felt crushing guilt standing there. Guilt for protecting myself. Guilt for hurting my children. Guilt for finally choosing my own dignity after a lifetime of sacrifice. But underneath the guilt sat something stronger now. Peace. Small. Fragile, but real. Jason shook his head slowly. I don't even recognize you anymore. I looked at him sadly. No, Jason. You just finally see me as a person instead of a solution. That silenced him instantly. Ethan grabbed his coat without another word. Before leaving, he stopped near the front door. You know what the saddest part is, he said quietly. I waited. You think this money is going to fix broken people? I looked directly at my oldest son. No, I answered softly. I think kindness might. For one brief second, something flickered across his face again. Not anger, pain, real pain. Then it disappeared. He walked out without saying goodbye. Melissa left shortly after crying quietly the entire way to her car. Jason never looked back, and suddenly, the house became silent. Just me and Olivia standing alone in the living room, surrounded by decades of memories. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. Then Olivia wrapped her arms around me tightly. I'm sorry, she whispered. I held her like I used to hold her as a little girl, and for the first time in months, I let myself cry freely. Not because I regretted my decision, because deep down, I finally understood something heartbreaking. Sometimes saving yourself means accepting that the people you love may never forgive you for refusing to let them use you. And that night, I realized my children might already be gone for good. After that night, the silence from my children became almost complete. No calls from Ethan. No dramatic check-ins from Melissa. No late-night visits from Jason. At first, the quiet hurt more than the arguments ever had. For 40 years, motherhood had shaped every part of my life. My days used to revolve around lunchboxes, school concerts, doctor appointments, college tuition weddings, broken hearts, emergencies. Then suddenly, nothing. No voices, no chaos. Just silence echoing through a house full of memories. The first few mornings felt unbearable. I would wake automatically expecting messages or missed calls. There were none. Sometimes I caught myself staring at my phone for long stretches, wondering if I should reach out first. Maybe apologize. Maybe explain myself again. That old instinct to fix everything still lived inside me. But each time, I remembered the dining room, the spreadsheets, the percentages, the entitlement. And slowly, painfully, I began understanding something important. Keeping peace at the cost of your dignity is not love, it's surrender. So instead of calling my children, I started rebuilding pieces of myself. Little pieces. Small things most people probably wouldn't even notice. I began taking morning walks again. Richard used to love early mornings. He always said the world felt more honest before noon. Some days I walked through the neighborhood park, wrapped in a thick coat, while winter faded slowly into spring. Other mornings, I sat on a bench watching ducks cross the frozen pond, while drinking coffee from a paper cup. And for the first time in years, my mind felt quiet, not happy. Healing is not happiness. Healing is learning how to breathe again after emotional drowning. Olivia visited often, never with questions, never with pressure. Sometimes she simply brought groceries, sometimes coffee, sometimes nothing except herself. One afternoon, we planted flowers in the backyard together while sunlight spilled softly across the garden. "You seem calmer lately," she said carefully. I smiled faintly. I think I'm finally learning the difference between loneliness and peace. She looked thoughtful for a moment. "What's the difference? Loneliness hurts?" I said softly. "Peace heals." The words surprised even me, because they were true. For months, I believed I was terrified of losing my children. But what I was truly terrified of was admitting they had already stopped treating me with love long before I changed my will. About 3 weeks after the family meeting, Melissa finally called. I stared at her name on my phone for nearly a full minute before answering. Hello, silence. Then a shaky breath. Hi, Mom. Her voice sounded smaller somehow. Not polished, not rehearsed, just tired. How are you? I asked carefully. Another silence. Then she laughed weakly. I don't think you actually want the answer. That honesty caught me off guard. We spoke awkwardly at first. Weather, work, Olivia, safe subjects. But eventually, Melissa's voice cracked. I've been angry, I know. No, I mean really angry. I sat quietly in Richard's old chair, listening. Then she whispered something I never expected to hear. But I've also been ashamed. My chest tightened instantly. Because shame meant awareness, and awareness meant maybe not certainty, but maybe there was still humanity underneath all the greed and fear. Melissa started crying softly. I don't know when I became this person. Tears filled my own eyes immediately, because neither did I. I was scared, she admitted. After Dad died, everything felt unstable. I listened quietly. Daniel's business hasn't been doing well, she continued. The mortgage, the kids' tuition. I kept thinking if something happened to you, at least there'd be security. Security. Such a human word, not greed. Fear. For the first time in months, I finally saw something deeper beneath her behavior. Not an excuse, but an explanation. I understand being afraid, I whispered. Melissa cried harder. But that doesn't excuse how we treated you. No, it didn't. But hearing her finally say it mattered more than she probably realized. We talked for almost an hour. Not perfectly, not magically healed, but honestly. And honesty felt like sunlight after months trapped underground. Ethan still refused contact completely. Benjamin informed me that he had consulted another attorney briefly before apparently backing away from legal action. That didn't surprise me. The paperwork was airtight. But more than that, I think Ethan finally realized challenging me publicly would expose exactly how ugly the situation had become. Jason disappeared entirely for a while. Then one rainy evening, I found a handwritten note tucked into my mailbox. No envelope, no stamp, just folded paper. Mom, I'm still angry, but I've also been thinking a lot about Dad lately. Maybe we all forgot he cared more about people than money. I don't know if I'm ready to talk yet, but I wanted you to know I read the letters Olivia told me about. I'm sorry for some things I said. Jason. I stared at that note for a very long time. Not because it fixed everything. It didn't. But because it proved something important. Sometimes people only hear the truth after losing access to what they thought mattered most. A month later, Diane invited me to visit the Foundation's first renovated housing wing. The old transitional rooms looked completely different now. Fresh paint, new furniture, warm lighting, real beds instead of temporary cots. Women smiled in hallways that once felt hopeless. One resident hugged me tightly after learning about the donation. You have no idea what this place means to us, she whispered through tears. But I did know, because somewhere along the way, helping them had also saved me. Diane walked beside me through the renovated building quietly. You seem lighter, she observed. I thought about that, then nodded slowly. I spent my whole life believing love meant endless sacrifice. And now I looked down the hallway toward women laughing softly near the community kitchen. Now I think love also requires boundaries. Diane smiled gently. That's wisdom, Addison. Most people learn it too late. Maybe she was right. Or maybe pain simply teaches lessons comfort never could. That evening, I returned home just before sunset. Golden light spilled across the front porch Richard built decades ago. I stood there for several long moments before unlocking the door. The house still felt quieter than it once had. Still emptier, but not haunted anymore. Not suffocating, just peaceful. And for the first time in a very long time, I finally stopped waiting for my children to become who they used to be. Because deep down, I was beginning to understand something difficult but freeing. You cannot force people to love you correctly. You can only decide whether you'll continue allowing them to hurt you. And at 68 years old, I had finally chosen myself. 6 months later, I stood in front of a building that used to be abandoned. Now, it carried a brand new sign, Clark House, a safe place to begin again. For a moment, I couldn't breathe. The morning sunlight stretched across the front windows while volunteers moved tables and flowers into place for the opening ceremony. Women stood near the entrance, smiling nervously, some holding coffee cups in trembling hands. A few of them had already moved into the residence weeks earlier. Others were still arriving from shelters, hospitals, and temporary housing programs. Every single one of them carried a story: loss, betrayal, fear, survival. And somehow, standing there in the cold spring air, I realized something that made tears fill my eyes. Instantly, Richard would have loved this place. Not because his name was on the building, because it gave people dignity. That was always the kind of man he was. Diane walked toward me, holding a clipboard, and smiled warmly. You ready? I laughed softly through my nerves. Not even a little. Yes, you are. She squeezed my hand gently. You've already done the hardest part. Maybe she was right. The hardest part hadn't been signing papers. It hadn't been legal meetings or family arguments. The hardest part had been accepting that protecting myself did not make me selfish. That lesson nearly took me 70 years to learn. Inside the building, volunteers arranged pastries and coffee along long folding tables, while soft music played through ceiling speakers. The atmosphere felt warm, alive. Nothing like the cold tension that once filled my own dining room. One woman named Patricia, the former bakery owner I met months ago, approached me slowly using a cane. Her eyes watered immediately when she saw me. You really did it, she whispered. I hugged her carefully. No, I said softly. We did. Patricia shook her head. You gave us a second chance. The words nearly shattered me, because for so long I believed my money represented conflict, pain, division. But here, for the first time, it represented safety, healing, hope. As guests slowly filled the building, I noticed Olivia standing near the hallway, helping one of the residents carry blankets into her room. She looked over and smiled the moment she saw me. God, I loved that girl. Not because she supported my decisions, because she cared about people naturally. No manipulation, no hidden agenda, just kindness. And in the end, kindness mattered more than blood ever did. The ceremony began around noon. Diane spoke first about elder abuse abandonment and the growing number of older women left financially vulnerable after losing spouses. Several local reporters attended. So did community leaders, volunteers, social workers, but strangely standing there among strangers felt more genuine than many family gatherings I'd attended recently. Then Diane called my name. My hands immediately started shaking. I can't do speeches, I whispered. Yes, you can, she replied firmly. So I walked slowly to the front of the room while polite applause filled the space. For a second, I froze completely. Dozens of faces looked back at me. Some hopeful, some emotional, some exhausted from lives harder than mine. I gripped the podium tightly and took a slow breath. My husband and I spent our lives building something together. I began softly. The room quieted instantly. Like many couples, we thought success meant saving enough money to leave our children comfortable after we were gone. I swallowed hard. But somewhere along the way, I realized money means very little if it doesn't leave behind kindness too. Several women wiped tears from their eyes, including me. I looked around the room slowly. There were moments after my husband died when I felt invisible. Not because I was alone, but because grief changed the way people looked at me. My voice trembled, and I learned something painful. Aging can make people feel forgotten, disposable, powerless. Silence filled the building. But this place, I looked around carefully. This place exists to remind people that dignity doesn't disappear with age. Applause rose softly through the room. Not loud, not dramatic, just genuine. And somehow, that made it even more emotional. After the ceremony ended, people stayed for hours, talking, laughing, sharing stories. One elderly woman hugged me tightly and whispered, I thought nobody saw us anymore. I cried in the restroom afterward, not sad tears, relief tears, the kind that come after carrying emotional weight for too long. When I finally stepped back into the hallway, I froze. Melissa stood near the front entrance, alone. She looked smaller somehow. Not physically, emotionally, like life had humbled her over the past few months. For a second, neither of us moved. Then she slowly walked toward me. I almost didn't come. Her voice shook badly. I nodded quietly. I'm glad you did. Tears immediately filled her eyes. She looked around the building slowly before speaking again. I didn't understand before. No excuses, no manipulation, just honesty. That mattered. Melissa wiped her face quickly. After everything happened, I kept hearing the things we said to you that night. I stayed silent, because some wounds deserve space. She looked directly at me. We sounded horrible. The raw shame in her voice hurt my heart. Not because I wanted revenge, because no mother wants her children drowning in regret either. I was scared, she admitted softly. About money, about life, about losing stability. I know. But none of that justified treating you like... Her voice broke completely. Like your worth depended on what you could leave us. Tears blurred my vision instantly. For several seconds, neither of us could speak. Then Melissa whispered the words I honestly never thought I would hear. I'm sorry, Mom. Not defensive, not performative. Real. God help me. It healed something inside me immediately. Not everything. Some damage never disappears completely. But enough. I stepped forward and wrapped my arms around her carefully. Melissa broke down, sobbing against my shoulder like she used to as a little girl during thunderstorms. And suddenly, for the first time in years, I felt my daughter again. Not the frightened woman obsessed with inheritance, just my daughter. When she finally pulled away, she looked embarrassed by her tears. I smiled softly. You still cry exactly the same way you did at 7 years old. That made her laugh through tears. A real laugh. Later that evening, after everyone left, I stood outside Clark House beside Olivia, watching the sunset spill gold across the parking lot. The air smelled like spring flowers and fresh paint. Peaceful. Finally peaceful. Olivia slipped her arm through mine gently. You okay, Grandma? I looked up at the glowing windows of the building carrying Richard's name. Women inside laughed softly over dinner. Safe, warm, seen. And deep down, I finally understood something clearly. I hadn't destroyed my family. I had stopped sacrificing myself to keep broken patterns alive. And somehow, that truth led us all here. I squeezed Olivia's hand gently and smiled through tears. Yes, I whispered, for the first time in a very long time. I really am. If this story touched your heart, please don't forget to like and subscribe. And I'd truly love to hear from you in the comments. What would you have done if you were in Addison's place? Do you believe money reveals who people truly are? And wherever you're watching from tonight, tell me your city and the time there. I read more comments than you know, and your stories mean so much to me.